All right, everyone, I'm about to begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 15th Annual Fair and Affordable Housing Summit here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My name is Wanda Allen Averha, and I am the Director of the City of Winston-Salem Human Relations Department. We are particularly excited about this year's format because we're bringing it to you virtually. And so, of course, in the face of the pandemic and the current restrictions that we have here in North Carolina, we wanted to err on the side of caution and bring you this information virtually. However, we did not want to forego convening everyone to talk about some very important housing updates, policy changes, and laws. So we have a plethora of experts today. We are very excited to have on this platform to share with you all kinds of information that we know you will definitely appreciate and take back to your respective communities. So we are really also quite fortunate to have a slate of wonderful and dynamic speakers, including those who are bringing the welcome and greetings. And definitely we want to emphasize the fact that we have the Acting Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity from HUD headquarters with us today, Assistant Secretary Janine Warden. So I want to just kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be doing. So the way things will flow, we will definitely hear, of course, from our local elected officials, including Mayor Alan Joines and Mayor Pro Tem Denise D. Adams. And Mayor Joines and Mayor Pro Tem Adams pre-recorded their greetings at the beginning of this month because they were unable to join us today. So we will be playing their pre-recorded greetings, and then we will proceed to have the goals and purpose shared with us by none other than Pastor Robert Leake, who is the chairperson of the Winston-Salem Human Relations Commission. And then we will go into the special remarks and the opening comments from Assistant Secretary Warden. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and hear from our local elected officials.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Joines, Mayor of Winston-Salem, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual fair housing meeting and workshop. It's something we do every year to bring together sponsors, to bring together providers, lenders, and others that are interested in the whole issue of fair housing. I want to thank our Human Relations Commission as well as the staff for always putting on a great presentation. And I thank all of those who are participating in this today. And more importantly, thank you all of you who are being part of this workshop. It's such an important issue for our city to make sure that housing opportunities are available to all of our citizens, no matter what. As you know, we have a strong need to create matter of fact, 14,000 new affordable units over the next 8 years. So all of us will have to work together to make sure that fair housing comes into play. So thank you for being a part of this.
Hello, Winston-Salem. I am Dee Dee Adams, Councilmember Mayor Pro Tem of the North Ward, but I'm also the chair of our Community Development, Housing and General Government Committee. I can't tell you how important it is that this summit takes place. It's been going on for many, many years, and it has an important place in the history and the activism and advocacy of housing here in Winston-Salem. I want to thank the Human Relations Department. I want to thank all of the sponsors, and I want to thank everyone that works every day to try to improve the housing, building it, preserving it, and protecting it for all of us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Pastor Robert Leake III, and I am the chairperson for the Human Relations Commission. I bring greetings on behalf of the Human Relations Commission, as well to my colleague, Vice Chair Commissioner Kerry Wiggins. This is our 15th year celebration as we look over our past history, as we celebrate Fair Housing Month over the years, but also as we continue on champion for affordability housing for all of our citizens here in Winston-Salem. But our purpose for today's event is to bring together housing, government, education, banking, and community nonprofit representatives to share important housing information updates from across the United States, particularly locally. Our goal for this summit today is to bring together housing professionals to discuss and provide updates on policy and practices and law, as well to highlight successful housing initiatives that address housing discrimination and housing affordability. And our last goal this afternoon is to make sure information is shared with community residents as well with neighborhood associations leaders here across the city of Winston-Salem. Again, on behalf of the Human Relations Commission, we thank you all for participating in this year's 15th year celebration of our Fair and Affordable Housing Summit. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you, Chair Leak, and thank you, Mayor Joines, and thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. We are very fortunate here in Winston-Salem to have such a strong support system with our amongst our elected officials and also with our Human Relations Commission. And as Chair Leak mentioned, this is National Fair Housing Month. So we are excited, and we've been excited all month long to really highlight and emphasize the importance of the Fair Housing Act. And here locally in Winston-Salem, our Fair Housing Ordinance is substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And what that means is that we are a HUD partner in the Fair Housing Assistance Program. So we investigate claims of housing discrimination here within the city limits of Winston-Salem. That is one of the main charges that our department has, in addition to investigating landlord-tenant complaints. And of course, we have a very strong outreach program that focuses on cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we're really proud to have had the Winston-Salem Human Relations Commission, which predates the department, goes back to the 70s. And we are very excited to continue in this important work. And as you all know, this is a very volatile time in our nation's history with all that is going on with the social injustices and race relations tensions and so forth. And we're seeing these things happening at a level that we have not seen probably since the days of the civil rights marches and things, riots and things of that nature. And so we really need entities like the Human Relations Commission and Department at a time like this. And HUD is certainly a partner that we value very greatly, particularly as it pertains to the housing discrimination fight. And so, without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce to you our very special opening speaker, and that is Assistant Secretary Janine Worden. Janine Worden is the Acting Assistant Secretary for Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For 10 years, she served as the Associate General Counsel for Fair Housing in the Department's Office of General Counsel, responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Prior to joining HUD, Ms. Worden was a manager in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she supervised investigations and litigation and directed the Justice Department's Project Civic Access Initiative to remedy state and local governmental noncompliance with disability rights laws. Before joining the Department of Justice, Ms. Worden worked at a major Washington, D.C. law firm, specializing in civil litigation and advising clients about federal, state, and local civil rights laws. She received her Juris Doctorate degree from Columbia University School of Law, master's degrees from Middlebury College and the Johns Hopkins University, and an undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago. She is a member of the Virginia, District of Columbia, and Maryland bars. And so as you see and as you hear, we are very, very fortunate to have someone of Janine Warden's stature to join us today. And so, Assistant Secretary Warden, I turn it over to you. Welcome to Winston-Salem virtually.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and happy Fair Housing Month, everyone. As was previously said, we are in a very unusual time right now, a very challenging time. The country has lost over 500,000 of our fellow Americans due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic has shed the light on a lot of social inequities that have been part of the fabric of this country for a very long time. You know, viruses don't discriminate typically, but a lot of times viruses can have very discriminatory effects because of some of the social inequities that exist in our society. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a lot of these inequities over the past year. We have seen that African Americans are far more likely to be hospitalized and die from the COVID-19 virus. And the issue is really, it has a lot to do with factors that have long been in existence in our society. It has to do with close living quarters, housing that is far more congested, lack of access to health care, many, many social inequities. And similarly, there's been a higher hospitalization rate and death rate for Hispanics or Latinos, and also for Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. And these disparities are actually, they're evidence of the fact that there is still a lot more work for us to do. And there is particularly a lot of work for us to do in the area of fair housing. Housing is kind of the leveler. You know, the zip code where you live is a huge determinant of how healthy you're going to be over your life. The zip code where you're born is a huge determinant of the amount of wealth and opportunity you're going to experience over the course of your life. You know, I personally was born into a low-income family, and I attended different schools because I have a disability. Sometimes I was in majority white schools, and sometimes I was in majority minority schools, and I saw the differences. I saw that some schools have a lot of resources and provide a lot of opportunities, and other schools provide far fewer opportunities. And so these are some of the disparities that we need to work hard to address over the coming years. And, you know, one thing I like to say about fair housing and civil rights, there's always a lot more work for us to do. So even when we have some accomplishments, that's just one step forward. There's still a long journey for us to make. I'd like to talk a little bit to you about some of the priorities that we at HUD have going forward, because I'm very excited and thrilled and honored to be able to serve in the position of Acting Assistant Secretary under the Biden administration and under the very strong leadership of our HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge, who is a true champion for fair housing and civil rights. So in February of this year, HUD made a very important announcement. We determined that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's not a new area of discrimination. It's actually discrimination because of sex. And sex discrimination now is interpreted to include LGBTQ plus discrimination as well in housing and lending. And we were able to reach this conclusion because of a ruling issued by the Supreme Court last June. The ruling was in Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. And the court did a plain language analysis of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and held that the term discrimination because of sex really required consideration also of discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a very significant advancement in helping to achieve equality in the United States. I'm very pleased to say that HUD was the first federal agency to follow the president's executive order in adopting this interpretation under the Fair Housing Act. And we look forward to working with all of our partners in our Fair Housing Assistance agencies and our Fair Housing Initiative Program agencies, the state and local governments such as Winston-Salem that enforce fair housing protections, as well as the fair housing nonprofit groups that are out helping individuals with from various protected class groups identify and combat discrimination. Another priority that we have under the President Biden's and Secretary Fudge's leadership relates to racial inequity and government support for underserved communities. I cannot emphasize how important this area is. I can't overemphasize it because it's just going to be at the foundation of everything that we at HUD are doing going forward. It's a very ambitious undertaking in a variety of ways because what the president has asked HUD to do is take a look at all of our own programs and see what ways our programs pose barriers for people in different underserved populations and underserved communities, and then find the solutions to those barriers. This is going to be an agency-wide endeavor, but one of the first places that HUD is going to be looking is at fair housing enforcement and how we can make fair housing enforcement at HUD stronger by forming stronger partnerships with our Fair Housing Assistance Program agencies and our Fair Housing Initiatives Program agencies, and also bringing back some of the tools that have become a little less effective over the past several years. I am very excited to announce that we are in the midst of a rulemaking process. So, one of the things that occurred during the last administration was some rulemaking that took away some of the tools that we had for effective fair housing enforcement. During the last administration, there was the publication of a new disparate impact rule, which made it much harder to prove discrimination using a disparate impact theory. There was also the publication of a rule that was titled Preserving Community and Neighborhood Choice. And what that rule did was really take away obligations that grantees had, not only to combat discrimination, but really to undo the historic vestiges of discrimination, particularly race discrimination, national origin discrimination, and discrimination on the basis of disability. So just a few days ago, HUD was very pleased to announce that it has submitted 2 rulemakings to the Office of Management and Budget for review. I can't tell you a lot about what those rulemakings are about, but I can tell you the titles, and we're pretty good at putting effective titles on these documents. One of them is a notice of proposed rulemaking that is about restoring a discriminatory effects standard under the Fair Housing Act. And the other is a proposed interim final rulemaking that would restore statutory definitions and certifications relating to affirmatively furthering fair housing under the Fair Housing Act. If you take a look at President Biden's executive orders on racial equity and underserved communities and populations, you will see that these rules are important fair housing tools that he directed HUD to take a close look at and make sure that they actually served the purposes of the Fair Housing Act. I am very hopeful that we will receive a quick review from the Office of Management and Budget. And once that review is completed, we will be able to publish the proposed rulemakings in the Federal Register. So stay tuned, there's more to come. On the issue of COVID-19, we are currently working on addressing technical assistance to help people throughout the country understand the discrimination that can be associated with COVID-19. There have been some unfortunate patterns of harassment based on national origin that have resulted because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and some unfortunate associations that people have erroneously made between COVID-19 and certain Asian American groups. So it's very important that we all have a good understanding that that discrimination in connection with COVID-19 is simply not permitted in the housing or lending context, including harassment associated with individuals who are Asian American living in their homes, or people who are thought to be at higher risk or higher propensity to transmit COVID-19. So our guidance is going to answer some of the important questions related to COVID-19 and the Fair Housing Act. Such as the extent to which COVID-19 may be a disability under the Fair Housing Act. I'll give you a quick heads up, it may be. And how to avoid discrimination associated with COVID, including in the context of reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. I'd like to give you a few more ideas of where we're heading in terms of some of the fair housing and fair lending enforcement that we're going to be doing. Our new secretary has made clear that she is very concerned about the current gaps in home ownership related to race and national origin, and that there need to be better opportunities for first-time home buyers, and we need to tackle some of the longstanding disparities that have prevented African Americans and other minorities from becoming first-time homeowners. You know, purchasing a home is the traditional way that families in America gain wealth. The first generation acquires the home and then they pass it down to the generations going forward. And when you no longer have to pay rent and you have the safety of a home to live in that has already been paid for, it really puts you far ahead on the ability to acquire wealth and achieve additional opportunity in life. So FHEO, and we certainly hope our partners, are going to be working on issues related to increasing home ownership opportunities for those who have been deprived of those opportunities in the past. Some of the areas that we're going to be looking at are really discrimination in lending. We're also going to be looking at discrimination in the context of appraisals. Because we have been receiving more and more complaints alleging disparities in the appraisal process and how race and the community and the characteristics of the people who live in a community where a house is located have unfairly caused appraisal values of some homes to be low. So we're going to be taking a look at how do we get bias out of the appraisal process and improve opportunities for home ownership. We have a very ambitious agenda going forward. We're going to be focusing on some of the systemic discrimination that has been occurring, and we're going to be fully utilizing the tools at our disposal, the Fair Housing Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of these laws have a place in fair housing enforcement, and we at HUD are going to make sure that we're using these tools to the best of our ability. We're going to be very active in the fair housing space, and one of the key takeaways I want everyone to have is that the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity and HUD are open for business, and we are going to be dealing with the historic issues that confront housing in our country, including denial of access to opportunity, segregation, and disparate treatment. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you. I took a look at your agenda. I think you really have a very informative and educational program going forward, and I wish I could join you. But thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Warden. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate all of the updates that you shared with us that HUD is undertaking. And we are really excited to be working, of course, jointly, as always, with HUD as a local partner here in the city of Winston-Salem. So thank you so much. I am unable to turn my camera on, so I'm going to continue. It says I have to have the host to do that, and I'm not the host, so we're going to continue on. Next, we're going to go ahead and highlight some of our key successes and accomplishments over the past 15 years. We definitely do have quite a bit to celebrate here in the community. We've had a lot of things going on, not just with the city of Winston-Salem, with Forsyth County government and others, but we have a lot of things that we want to show you that we have done over 15 years just with this summit alone. And I would be remiss if I did not recognize the fact that this summit is planned by the New Horizons Fair Housing Committee, which is a committee of the Human Relations Commission. And the committee is comprised of key community partners and stakeholders here in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County. And all of them are represented here on the call today. We have Power Up represented. We have the Financial Pathways of the Piedmont represented, UNCG, Legal Aid. We have Wake Forest University represented through the panel discussion, Winston-Salem State. I mean, it goes on and on. Piedmont Federal, Experiment and Self-Reliance, as we call them, ESR, the Housing Authority of the City of Winston-Salem, and the Winston-Salem Regional Association of Realtors. So all of these people make up that planning committee, and they do a stellar job each and every year. And I would just like to thank them at this time. So now we will go ahead and show you some of our highlights from the past 15 years of doing the Fair and Affordable Housing Summit.
I hope that we will all agree that it's absolutely essential to the advancement of justice and the promise of America that we build our communities in a more integrated and inclusive way.
HUD builds communities. That's what we're about. We're about building communities that are sustainable and involve everyone. That means we need to make it better for everyone.
And I think the one piece that emerges in our analysis of residential segregation using statistics is that Winston-Salem is not among the most segregated cities in the United States. And I say that because I've been at many talks where individuals have made that claim, and I think it feels like it's among the most segregated.
In the next 20 years, we're going to gain 400,000 people in our region. We're going to grow from roughly 1,600,000 to about 2 million in this 12-county region. Where are those 400,000 people going to live? How will they be able to afford where they live?
What is the American dream, right? For many of us, the American dream consists of owning a home. The Civil Rights of 1968, which is the Fair Housing Law, compels us to provide equal housing opportunities for all. So implicit in the American dream, I want to argue, is the goal that our homes will provide not only shelter, but also a source of wealth on which we all can retire.
I'm Wanda Allen Abraha. I am the Director of the Human Relations Department with the City of Winston-Salem. We're so pleased to see all of you here today. We have a full house, and we're delighted to welcome you to our 10th annual Fair and Affordable Housing Summit.
So all of you dedicate, I imagine, your lives in some important way of getting people to opportunity, right? I'm going to say that I have a tendency to see the other side. The glass is half empty side, because I deal a lot with people who are having barriers to opportunity.
Affordable housing is so important. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, shelter is, right there. If you don't have it, you can't really be all you want to be in life.
We work tirelessly, our staff, every day to ensure, as well as our Human Relations Department, to ensure that the least of us are allowed the same opportunities that the rest of us are accustomed to.
I grew up in Section 8 housing for a majority of my life, and I grew up only seeing the massive mansions of Winston-Salem during Halloween because we knew that they would give the most candy, and they never failed. Oftentimes they'd have huge buckets with candy, and we just, fill our bags. We only had to go to 1 or 2 houses. I grew up housing and food insecure, and so as I stand before you today, I may not be an expert in terms of statistics, in terms of practice, but I have a lived experience which allows me to speak about what it is like to not always have access to fair and affordable housing.
That when you have community, when you got people, you're empowered, the doors seem to open a little bit better for you. I think we all know that to be true, and we're glad to be people with our friends who are still searching for their stable housing here in the city of Winston-Salem. We're glad to be partnering with you all in making that happen for them, so thanks.
Well, I'm going to give you just a little brief thing about our economy, because to me, that's what drives our ability to do affordable housing. It drives our ability to address poverty. It drives our ability to provide the social and recreational amenities for our community. Working together, we have made impact in all these areas of jobs, of quality of life, and in housing. So
we, as the Fair Housing Committee, as well the Human Relations Commission, believes that everyone has a right to affordable, decent housing despite their economic needs.
Even though we're here to talk about housing and affordable housing, let me just tell you that from a poverty standpoint, I was just in shock over some of the details, some of the facts, some of the data that came across. Of course, we worked towards looking at education and life skills, workforce development, wellness and food access and insecurity, and it's amazing how it all ties into housing. It really truly is. They're all just interconnected.
Planning for housing opportunity requires that we involve residents from all income levels, not just in charrettes and public forums held at noon on Monday in the City Hall, but ongoing interactions that are actively engaging residents throughout the process and with the communities in where they live now.
All right, and so that gives you a very good overview of what has been happening with our Fair and Affordable Housing Summit over the past 15 years. And please note, it is our 15th year this year, because last year we were unable to hold the summit because the pandemic was just getting started. And so now this marks our 15th time holding the summit. So anyway, moving on the agenda, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker. Actually, she's going to be presiding over the bulk of the remainder of today's program. And her name is Phyllis Caldwell-George. And Ms. Caldwell-George is the CEO of Financial Pathways of the Piedmont. And I am just really delighted to have been privileged to work with her over the past probably almost 20 years now as a partner out in the community in the fight for fair and affordable housing for all. She is a real champion of helping people to be able to buy homes, as well as helping people to understand their rights and responsibilities when it comes to home ownership. And Phyllis is just a real treasure to us all on the New Horizons Fair Housing Committee. And so she has graciously agreed to preside over today's panel discussion. And it is also important to note that over the past several years, Mr. Dan Cornelis was actually the person who moderated our panel discussion, and Mr. Cornelis recently retired from Forsyth County government. However, he was gracious enough to agree to still participate on the planning committee, and he is also a part of today's panel discussion. So Dan, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the support that you have provided to us all over the years. And we're just really glad that you're still a part of this planning process, and we invite you to continue to do so in years to come. So without further ado, Phyllis, you can take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Wanda. And thanks for reminding me that I have such huge shoes to fill with Dan being the past moderator in previous years. But I am going to do my absolute best. And I am personally excited about the panel of experts that we have today and also the subject matter that they will be discussing. But before we get started, what we'll do is actually have the panelists briefly introduce themselves in the order of their presentation. And if we could start with the first presenters, and that starts with Dan Cornelis as well.
Good afternoon. I am Dan Cornelis, and I am retired, and it's a very interesting time now after retirement, but I still look forward to working with this group. I've been asked to talk about the home ownership trail that has been blazed here in Forsyth County and Winston-Salem over the last few years, or maybe the last 20 years, I should say. And I'd like to start with what happened in 1990 with the passage of a federal bill that created the home program. This program gave a lot of funds, a substantial number of funds, out to cities, counties, and states that could be used to provide more opportunities with affordable housing. Winston-Salem was a direct beneficiary of this, and we sat down and talked, the county and the city, and we decided to form what was called a consortium. The consortium allowed us to get more funding, but also to give us more funds to use in the unincorporated areas of Forsyth County and the municipalities. These funds could be used for a lot of different things, from anywhere from providing home ownership opportunities to building houses, to building whole neighborhoods, to putting infrastructure in, and to a lot of tenant rental assistance and so forth. So those programs really allowed a lot of things by the local governments. Here in Forsyth County and Winston-Salem, we did form a consortium, and the focus for the county centered more on working with what we would call the demand side of housing, while the city, they used a lot of their funds to work on the supply side. So while the city was building new neighborhoods and providing more affordable housing opportunities for home ownership, the county was looking at subsidizing down payment assistance with their home money and with money from the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency that allowed folks to buy a home that they otherwise would not be able to afford. We also worked with, the county worked with getting folks ready for homeownership. And at some point in time in the process, Monica Lett used to be with the city, came up with this idea that we needed to have a center for homeownership. And Phyllis Codwell George was the first actual director of that program. And it's done a lot of good for the city and county as far as getting folks so that they understand home ownership and that they can maintain their home once they move in. We ended up developing a local home ownership delivery system that really was outstanding, did outstanding work. It brought a lot of folks together to the table to talk about what roles they play in getting folks prepared for home ownership and to find a home to buy. The partners that we have had and still have today, that partnership still exists. And I just want to name them real quickly. Partners include Forsyth County, the City of Winston-Salem, Habitat for Humanity, the Housing Authority of Winston-Salem, United Way of Forsyth County, the Housing Partnership of Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, Center for Home Ownership, Experiment and Self-Reliance, the federally funded Assets for Independence, North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, and most importantly, numerous banks and mortgage companies, numerous real estate firms. Results of this process has yielded us over 900 homeowners that are experiencing the American Dream. This is not including about 400 or 500 other units that were built by Habitat for Humanity. This also coincidentally provided total investments in these purchases amounted to over $100 million. And so this is $100 million that was going to folks that were 80% of median income or less, and that money was put back in our local economy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and good friend Bianca, who's going to talk a little bit about what has happened in the pandemic and how we're holding up under the homeownership program there.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 15th annual Fair and Affordable Housing Summit. I'm Bianca Green. I'm the loan officer with Forsyth County Community and Economic Development Department. Our department has been collaborative in working with the City of Winston-Salem, the Center for Home Ownership, Experiment and Self-Reliance with the IDA program, and also with the Housing Authority of Winston-Salem. And I wanted to touch bases on the type of things that has been coming into play since the pandemic. And I want to share with you the things that have come into play since the pandemic, since March of 2020. That have affected affordable home ownership in our area. There have been 6 major components or things that have come into play that has affected affordable home ownership in our area. One of the main things is that our area, Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, we have a favorable housing market. Affordable homes, the rental market as well is favorable. And so along with that, low interest rates have come into play to where the market has become very competitive. We have a lot of home buyers who are seeking home ownership. Along with that, since the pandemic, the high cost of building materials has played into the affordable home market, in that builders' costs have increased. And also we have had the opportunity to see the competitive investment buyers that have come into play in our market, and not only Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, but also within the Triad region and really on a national basis. That has meant record high home sales prices have increased. And with that, all of that coming to play, we have realized a dwindling supply of new and existing homes. The demand has increased, again, adding to that dwindling supply of affordable homes. The down payment assistance that we provide to assist home buyers in purchasing affordably come about through the funds that we receive from HUD, which are our consortium funds with the City of Winston-Salem, also with North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, because our goal is to assist home buyers in purchasing affordably. And so those type of things have affected our market here in this area since March 2020, since the COVID-19 pandemic. The rental market has increased, but we're also seeing that great demand of homeownership being sought after by millennials, as well as seasoned home buyers. And for that, we have been thankful for the assistance of Dr. Craig Richardson and the community CSEM office through the Winston-Salem State University to highlight the importance of affordable home ownership for low to moderate income families and its effect on helping individuals realize and experience asset building. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Craig Richardson.
Thank you, Bianca and Dan. All right, think I'm on? Okay, thank you so much, and I appreciate that introduction. I want to talk today about this project that we've been working on, that is this first-time home ownership program, and I'm excited to share with you some results. Now, when we started this project, I actually started by meeting Dan in the hall, and he mentioned to me that he had a lot of notebooks in his office, and they were sitting there for quite a long time, and those notebooks were actually a story about each individual homeowner that had come through that program. And being the data nerd that I am, I said, well, can we get our hands on these notebooks? I'd love to tell the story of what's happening with your program. And I said, but one thing about it is, you know, CSEM, we're not an advocate in the sense of saying we're just going to find the answer that we think is the right answer. We want to actually share these results. You know, what does the data tell us? And so we took those notebooks, and Dan was kind enough to say, well, look, you all report what you find, report the truth, because we want to know the success of this program. And that's what we did. We spent a year working with the county, working with Bianca, with my colleague, Zach Blizzard, Joseph Sloop from Map Forsyth, and many other people, literally taking hundreds of notebooks, each one of them chronicling one of these homeowners and their all sorts of statistics about where they ended up, how did they do, and so forth. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about these stories, because I really do think it's a remarkable success story. The process did take more than a year to input this data. We were not paid by the county. We did not want to be paid by the county because we wanted to, this is part of our giving back to the community through Winston-Salem State. And we didn't want to make it look like we were a proponent. We wanted to just find out what the data told us. So it took us a year. We're now, you know, writing up journal articles about this, but our objective was rigorous economic analysis using econometric regressions and lots of other statistical techniques. So we want to let the data tell the story. And really the question that we had was, from the basic question, is it working or not? And by that, what we mean, is rather than, we know that there's a social justice story here, but we also know that there are folks out there that want to say, hey, what's our return on investment here? Is this a good program or not a good program from the bottom line of the budget, right? And so there's a social justice side, but there's also the budget side. And so we looked at it really from a return on investment for the county's expenditures and really looking at what's happened to people when they came into this program. What was the wealth building? You know, we promised that there's wealth building when you own a home, but did that actually happen? What's the cost to benefit ratio for the county? Was there a contribution to the property tax base? If so, how much? And what were the losses? Were there foreclosures? So what we found was actually a story that was a success story in many ways. This shows and tracks the two groups of participants, the IDA participants who received financial counseling in blue, and the non-IDA participants who had slightly better financial footing to begin with. And both of them tracked very well, although IDA participants did slightly better. But what this story tells us is a great one, which is that after an average of 9 years, these folks who would have been renters have accumulated over $53,000 in home equity. We have contributed $3.7 million in this program in total equity after 9.5 years. Remember, this is a snapshot in time. Folks, this line is going to continue on, and after 20 years, we anticipate over $200,000 in net equity per participant. The other aspect is if you look at it as a return on investment to the county now has people paying property taxes who were renters before. They've contributed to this group alone, which is, by the way, a subset of the entire set. This is a set of people for which we had full data. We had about 500 in this subset out of the more than 800, contributed $6 million in property taxes. Well, we asked about foreclosures. Fair enough. What's the failure rate? Most of the foreclosures for people who've gone through this program in the last 15 years, most of them happened around the Great Recession. We've only had one, according to our data, who's had a foreclosure since that time. And so about 8% of the total, but again, like many homeowners, not just people in this program, there were failures around a housing collapse, which is not surprising. But certainly from the objective perspective, the vast majority of people are going through this program and holding on to their homes. What is the return on investment for Forsyth County? Well, every dollar that the county puts in yields $5.70 in home equity at the 9-year mark. Now, we know by the end of 30 years, this number is going to be a multiple of $5.70. So it's a 5.7 to 1, which is a tremendous finding, I think, and much larger than I would have ever guessed. In terms of our questions that we thought about, you know, in terms of what happened in terms of wealth building, we find that objectively speaking, this is a tremendous success story. There's $50,000 average after 9 years, $5.7 in wealth for every dollar spent by the county. By the way, the county spends about $2,000 per individual. We talk about the returns. And by the way, if I had more time, we'd also talk about where people move. But one of the astounding findings is that when people move to different neighborhoods, the crime rate in that new neighborhood was over 93% lower. So there's also some remarkable gains there in terms of geographic changes, in terms of schools and so forth. Property tax base is $6 million in county. In fact, this program is paying for itself. Dan could have been very successful in business because he pays attention to the county budget, and he's created a program that is actually a net gain for the county. This is not a net loss. It's a net gain. And so, as I mentioned, the number of foreclosures is very, very small. Now, in terms of future actions, our center, the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility at Winston-Salem State, is producing a film, which we are working title right now is Home Stretch. It used to be called The Forgotten Notebooks, but we've moved it to the emphasis on home. Home Stretch will be profiling some of the folks who have benefited from this program, and we anticipate this documentary to get some national exposure. We will be also featuring this program. I'm going to be speaking at Western Carolina next month, and this will be live streamed to the American Council of Education, so people all over the country are going to hear about the incredible success of this county program. And so I think I leave here today with the question, why not scale this program up? I talked with Bianca Green about this several days ago and said, what would it take if we wanted to double the size of this program, given that it not only meets our social justice goals, but it also meets the return on investment goals. Why not scale this program up? And I think that her response was the ask was very modest. She said, well, we need a few more staff people, and we could actually double what we do every year, which is, I believe, 20 to 30 homes per year. So I leave you with more information if you want to go and learn about. We have probably about 100 pages worth of analysis. There's our 2 working papers that are at our website here. And we have also published op-eds in the paper. And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Such valuable information. And just want to reiterate, this information will be available on the City of Winston-Salem website, and we'll also have those links that will be posted in the YouTube page as well. And so as participants are viewing this, or if they are looking at this later, they'll be able to access those links at a later time. I do want to just make sure that we have proper introductions for our last 3 speakers, and that was Dan Cornelius, who is retired in the position was the Community and Economic Development Director. And then also Dr. Craig Richardson, who's the Professor of Economics at Winston-Salem State University, and Bianca Green, who serves as Community and Economic Development Department Loan Officer. Thank you all for that great information. Also, if you have questions, you can also put those in the comments on the YouTube page, and we will hopefully have time at the end of each session to address those. Now we're going to move on to our next panelist, and that is Dr. Sherry Larson Clark. She is the Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Wake Forest University, and was also highlighted in the 15-year reel. And Dr. Sherry Larson Clark has joined us on numerous occasions to present information. Today, she's going to be talking about fair housing through the lens of the pandemic and social justice movement, and specifically on the East Winston neighborhood. Dr. Sherry Larson Clark, thank you. I'm turning it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the gracious introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I am a professor of anthropology at Wake Forest University, and what I would like to do over the next 10 minutes or so is to spend some time providing you with a short, small snapshot of housing precarity in East Winston. Housing precarity has historically been a problem in East Winston following more than a century of residential segregation due to redlining practices, restrictive covenants, and Black codes, et cetera, and has further been exacerbated with the onset of the pandemic. Like hurricanes and other natural and man-made disasters, COVID-19 has brought social inequality to the forefront of discussion and debates on the state of our union. So when I mention housing precarity, what is this? It can be defined as a state in which perceived exposure to an adverse event is increased. And precariousness is, to some extent, perceived because an individual's view of their circumstances may differ from reality. However, it is nonetheless important and likely to affect the association between states of precariousness and health and well-being, for example. So housing research normally has focused primarily on affordability, availability, and quality. And housing precarity research, on the other hand, extends the field by examining 4 components. And so we look at affordability, security, quality, and facilities, as well as access to essential services. My research also includes social interactions, both within the household, for example, romantic partner relationships, as well as outside the household, for example, relationships with tenants and neighbors, or relationships with landlords, and neighbors. So precarity often leads to displacement, in which people are compelled to leave the place in which they live territorially and symbolically. And that was anthropologist Seth Lowe. And when looking at this notion of precarity, and we see displacement, looking at symbolically the notion of home, looking at the home place and what the home place represents for families. And I argue that the home place is more than just a physical structure. It is a place where families can reside in and they have a site of resistance to outside forces such as poverty, the pandemic, oppression, racism, etc. Inside the home place is an area where families can build on their routines, they have stability, they have the power of who enters and who doesn't. Privacy is also part of this. And so I argue within looking at housing precarity, are there ways that we can build on the home place for our families? So looking at Forsyth County, there was research the Dr. Richardson also participated in with New America's Future Property Rights Program, the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic at Wake Forest University, the Department of Anthropology at Wake Forest, that we conducted last year, and looking at housing loss across the county. And what we saw there was there were 3 counties throughout the United States that New America was interested in, and Forsyth County was one of them. And we see in our county a housing loss rate of 2.6%, looking from 2014 through 2018. And so across those 5 years, the housing loss rate, which is the number of evictions and foreclosures divided by the total number of renters and households with a mortgage. And so that rate has been examined by New America and others to see where are we seeing housing precarity throughout the United States. So in Forsyth County, we see a 4.4 eviction rate. Another example is looking at the census tracts within the county, where we see those census tracts that were where predominantly Black residents lived had substantially higher rates of mortgage foreclosures as well as evictions. And so when we see sort of the numbers and the question marks that follow, they demand a closer look, right? And so we're looking at, while the county housing loss rate is 2.6% and with a 4.4% eviction rate, a closer look at the numbers shows an 11.7% eviction rate in one of the census tracts located in East Winston, coupled with higher numbers of renters versus homeowners, higher numbers of minority populations, concentrations of poverty, et cetera. And so in all of the data that we collect, my argument is for us to take a deeper dive into what these numbers actually mean. So in East Winston, we see evictions, large eviction rates. In fact, Winston-Salem is the 16th most evicting large city in the United States. And that's huge, right? When we think about what's going on in our city. We also have other cities in North Carolina, so it's not just asking what's going on in our county, but we see Greensboro, Fayetteville, Charlotte, High Point, also falling within the top 25 of most evicting large cities in the United States. We also see unemployment, nearly 8,000 low-income jobs, particularly in the accommodations and food services industries, have been lost in the county since the onset of the pandemic. And so we step and we pause and we look and we say, what's going on here? What's happening locally? What's happening across the state? And I want to look at, housing precarity and the way that it shapes and also is shaped by other factors. And so you can't look at housing precarity without looking at unemployment, without looking at health and comorbidity within homes, without looking at environmental hazards such as LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, without looking at education, crime, disinvestment, as well as food insecurity. And while time doesn't allow me to address all of these factors and their relationships, I do want to take time to speak briefly on food insecurity. So we have a map here, our charts of 2 maps here, looking at the county, Forsyth County. And what we see in Winston-Salem specifically is that Winston-Salem has been dubbed one of the most food insecure metropolitan areas in the United States. Again, pause. Why is this? What's going on? We report 21 individual food deserts, and that we can see with this map here on the left. We have the county itself reports the 7th highest frequency of food hardship in the country, with approximately 18% of its population experiencing food insecurity. Winston-Salem's food geography largely resembles its housing geography. And so we look at the map here on the right, and we see access to nutritious food is tenuous for the majority of East Winston residents, as well as for those residing in the north of the city center. And so we look at this housing geography, and the darker reds, we see higher rates of evictions, right? Housing loss here. And we map this over on places on the left where we have food deserts. And so going through the scarcity of foods throughout East Winston is linked to the city's history of redlining and disinvestment. Food store access and quality is consistently tied to neighborhood racial composition, illustrating the role of urban space production mediated by racialized public policy and urban planning and shaping patterns of neighborhood investment. And so all of these things, when we look at them closely, these numbers and maps, they don't lie. We need to see what are the relationships and how do we sort of stop this cycle. So I wanted to end with, what is it? We have this, what is it? What do we do about it? And so part of what we can do is think about fair and affordable housing opportunities in East Winston. And Dr. Richardson, he talked about the program at CSEM. I absolutely am looking at the first-time homebuyers program and as its success. And I do think these are opportunities that we should absolutely build upon, and focusing specifically in East Winston, what's going on there with the number of vacant homes there for affordable housing and individuals being able to secure mortgages as opposed to rent. I do think those are, this is one place that we could look into closely. Another thing is improve the quality of housing. So in my study, there are tenants, and I'm sure in others have talked about describing homes with leaky roofs and faucets, holes in the floor, poorly insulated and secure windows and doors, as well as tenuous relationships with their landlords and neighbors. And so how do we, when we think about quality is not just, sort of the outside outside, it's much of what's the inside, as well as relationships that are for those who are housed, and trying to increase, make them better. And also landlord-tenant relations. I think this is another area that we could focus on, and really having, landlords be part of the solution, as well as when working with tenants and tenants as well. Thinking about accessibility when we look at individuals and as well as the built environment. When I say accessibility, I'm thinking about the variability in how we communicate. And so we had the RUMA funds, for example, that came in from the government and resulting from COVID and the monies that came in from the federal government. How do those monies get disseminated? How does that information get disseminated? And so not everyone had access to the internet or those the places, not just the internet to get the information, but to then upload their information to be qualified for those funds. And so looking at variability in communication using various platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, local school district websites. And so there's so much information that comes from the school district. And I think, adding that into sort of these opportunities for communities, for households, for neighborhoods would be useful. Following youth groups, whether it's Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA, places where youth hang out, that information can be communicated there through to parents, I think is another avenue. Places of business, grocery stores, social service agencies, religious organizations, etc. This notion of accessibility to the built environment, I think, how do we decrease or eliminate physical barriers that separate communities and foster displacement? I think of, development efforts, gentrification efforts. Are there ways, right, that communities or individuals aren't displaced from their neighborhoods? Because many have attachment to their places, to where they live, to that place. And that attachment to place actually increases neighborhood and social cohesion, right? And it increases stability, right? And decreases precarity. So I think there are ways that we could think about our communities in ways ways that are not just sort of building on the numbers, but more in qualitative ways that help us to come together to make fair and affordable housing a reality for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sherry Lawson-Clark, for all the work that you're doing in this particular area, and also for offering up some very valid solutions that are things that we should be looking at and working on as a community, and specifically around the RUMA program. I think that those are some very good, solid suggestions. And again, thank you for everything you've done. We would like to move on to our next presenter, who will be talking about evictions and housing accessibility, and also federal and state moratorium. Edward Sharp, who's a JD attorney with the Legal Aid of North Carolina in the Greensboro office, will be presenting this information. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Sharp. I am an attorney with Legal Aid, and I just want to, I have sort of a nuts and bolts presentation. I'm not going to be talking in such brilliant terms as some of the academics that we've been hearing from, but I do have some basic nuts and bolts information as to what's going on with the federal and state moratoriums that still exist and will continue to exist until the 30th of June. The CDC order is the basis of all of the moratoriums in North Carolina. And it was extended by President Biden, or by the director of the CDC, to June 30th. Governor Cooper then issued yet another executive order in which he extended a moratorium in the state of North Carolina also to June 30th based on the CDC order. The reason this is important is because if by some chance the CDC order gets struck down by a court of competent jurisdiction in North Carolina, which would almost certainly be a federal court, then Governor Cooper's order would also be struck down. But if it's struck down by a court somewhere else, not in North Carolina, Governor Cooper included a savings clause in his executive order saying that the moratorium would continue unless and until some court here in North Carolina declares the CDC order unconstitutional. And there have been a couple of federal district courts that have declared it unconstitutional, but those courts do not have authority over North Carolina. The CDC order says on its face that it is only for non-payment. However, there is a pretty good argument to be made that it should also block holdover evictions, and I'm going to be talking about that in just a second. However, what I have noticed in court is that most magistrates who preside over evictions are not buying the argument that it also blocks holdover evictions. But the reason that's important is because if the tenant hasn't been paying rent for the last few months, the landlord is probably not knocking on their door to get them to sign a new lease, which means a lot of leases are now in month-to-month status. So usually what happens is when a person moves into a new apartment, they sign a lease that lasts for a year. And at the end of that year, it automatically goes to month-to-month status. Well, now lots and lots of leases in North Carolina are in month-to-month status. And in order to evict a tenant in that situation, the landlord merely needs to give them 7 days notice before the end of the term. The term is the month, unless the lease says otherwise. And frequently the lease does say otherwise. But in any event, 7 days, 30 days, whatever, you give the tenant notice that the month-to-month lease is terminated at the end of the month, and then the following day, the landlord is entitled to file an eviction of the tenant as a holdover. And a lot of landlords have figured this trick out and are in fact attempting to evict their tenants as holdovers. What we try to do is if we have evidence that the eviction is really about money, we try to go into court and argue that the holdover eviction is pretext. But if we have no evidence whatsoever that it really is about money, that argument is very hard to make. But sometimes we have emails or text messages or letters that show, or perhaps previous evictions, that got dismissed that were really about money. So we are sometimes able to show that the eviction is really about money, even when the landlord says it's about holdover. A couple things to note. I suppose the most important thing to note is that the Governor Cooper's moratorium, based upon the CDC order, is not automatic. It only stops, on its face, it only stops evictions for non-payment or possibly holdover. But evictions for criminal activity or breach of the lease can certainly go forward, and both the CDC order and Governor Cooper's executive order expressly say that evictions for those reasons can go forward. I have heard that of the evictions that are getting into court, only 10% of them are actually being stopped by Governor Cooper's order. What concerns me is that a lot of tenants think that it's automatic and they don't have to go to court, that the sheriff is never going to put them out because of the moratorium. This is completely false. The place to raise and litigate the moratorium is in court. And the only way to do that is for the tenant to go to the eviction trial and present their evidence that the moratorium should apply to them. Now, Governor Cooper has added some requirements, and one of them is that a landlord who seeks to evict a tenant for any reason at all must give them a blank copy of the CDC declaration form. And then they must file an affidavit with the court that says they have done that. Many landlords at the beginning were failing to do this. Now, more and more of them are getting with the program and are mailing or delivering a copy of a blank CDC declaration form to the tenants. Thank you, Wanda, for showing this. I'm going to be talking about this in just a second. Someone, I believe at the CDC, updated the form, and it is brilliantly done. As you can see, it includes column A, column B, and then on the back is column C. And you have to be able to check at least, or I guess it's not column C, it's part 2. But you have to be able to check at least one box in each of column A and column B. Excuse me. Basically, you have to have limited income. You have to have had your income has to have gone down substantially, or you're laid off from work, or your work hours were cut, or you've had extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. And not everybody can say that. Now, the reduction in income does not have to be COVID related. It just you just have to have had a loss of income or a loss of work hours, something like that. And then finally, part 2, you have to certify, the tenant has to certify that they have done their best to make timely partial payments that are as close as possible to the full payment, and to seek to get government assistance. And you have to certify that the tenant would have to certify that if evicted, they have no other good housing options, so they would become homeless or have to live with others in close quarters. And of course, that is a danger of spreading COVID. When we hand out these forms, we encourage tenants to read it very carefully and sign it only if it's true. Because signing it, if it's not true, as you can see right there, the tenant must sign it under penalty of perjury. And it's a crime to sign one of these things and it's not true. All right. A couple other things to understand. Violation of the governor's order, violation of the CDC order is a federal crime. Violation of the governor's order is a state crime, a class 2 misdemeanor. Now, I'm unaware of any landlord or any tenant who's actually been charged with this crime, but it wouldn't surprise me if that crime was charged. And so it's something to take very seriously. All right. Finally, I'm checking on my time. Finally, the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has recently issued a final interim rule, which I think is interesting, a final interim rule. But what that rule says is that it is an unfair debt collection practice to lie about the CDC eviction moratorium. The rule requires the debt collectors, which would include landlords, provide written notice to certain consumers of their protections under the CDC eviction moratorium and prohibit misrepresentations about consumers' ineligibility for protection under such moratorium. And some landlords are bullying their tenants and telling them that the protection doesn't apply to them. Well, that's not the landlord's decision to make. That's for a judicial official, such as a magistrate, to decide whether it applies. And the tenant themselves, they of course need to decide whether or not they can truthfully sign the CDC declaration. The other piece of this puzzle that I'm not going to cover, but I believe Dr. Sills is going to talk about, is rental assistance. We of course can't lay all this at the feet of landlords without expecting bad things to happen. The landlords need to be taken care of too. So in order to make this whole system work, there has to be rental assistance to help tenants pay the rent, which the moratorium does not affect the obligation to pay rent. That is made very, very clear in the CDC order and Governor Cooper's executive order. Rent is still due and owing, and it needs to get paid somehow. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. That was valuable information. And as we transition, it's just perfect for Dr. Stephen Sills, who's going to talk about housing and financial assistance during the pandemic. And Dr. Sills is a professor of sociology and the director of the Center for Housing and Community Studies at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. Dr. Sills.
Thank you so much, and that was a great segue into this talk about housing financial assistance during the pandemic. And I'm going to take us back pre-pandemic to start. COVID-19 landed during an already dire housing and eviction crisis, as we've heard from previous speakers. It has threatened to make that situation far worse. We had severe housing shortage across the state, rising rents, cost-burdened households, already a million households across the state who, when the unemployment spike hit, were further underwater on rents and mortgages. One of the most powerful interventions, as Ed has explained, was that Center for Disease Control's eviction moratorium. It has saved lives. There's multiple articles now in the peer-reviewed journals showing that hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved as a result of the application of the eviction moratorium, keeping people from stacking up in households or relying on homeless shelters for their needs. Now has come a series of waves of funding programs to try to repair the economic damages of having so many people displaced and so many people precariously housed. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that 1 in 5 homeowners in North Carolina, that's 19.9%, and 2 in 5 renters, or 43.3% across the state, 46.5% in Forsyth County, were considered cost burden. That means they're spending more than 30% of their incomes on housing and housing-related expenses, leaving little else left for food, for education, for medical care, for clothing, for other necessary goods and services. According to a 2020 study released just as the pandemic was hitting by the Urban Institute, there were a projected deficit of 380,000 low-income or affordable units in North Carolina. We were far below what we needed in 2020, and that has only gotten worse. The majority of low-income stock was unsubsidized, only about 1 million subsidized units across the state. These unsubsidized units have no public funding or support for the tenants that are relying on them. Some people call these NOAHs, or naturally occurring affordable housing. As a result of the lack of affordability, North Carolina already had a high eviction rate, as we've seen. 170,000 summary ejectments are filed across the state each year. We've just analyzed 5 years worth of court data and see that this trend has continued in the past 5 years. Lack of affordability, high eviction rates contributed to more than 30,000 people in the state experiencing homelessness in the year before the pandemic. This graph shows the unemployment claims by week across 2020. In March of 2020, Governor Cooper declared a state of emergency, and with this order, the state closed schools, restaurants, banned mass gatherings, and eventually issued a stay-at-home order that made most of us have to be sequestered. The shutdown of commerce resulted in an unemployment spike of 14.8%, the highest that had been recorded since data has been collected by the federal government. The leisure and hospitality industries in particular saw unemployment rates spiking to 39.3%. Initial claims for unemployment assistance had soared from about 3,500 weekly in the months of January, February, to over 172,000 at its peak in late March. More than 1.5 million unemployment claims were filed in 2020, about a third of the pre-pandemic workforce. We know that women, Latinx populations, immigrants, young workers, and those with less education were more vulnerable to layoffs, and those groups were already among the most precariously housed. Nationally, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, was passed in March of 2020. The CARES Act contained numerous health-related provisions for testing and research and was primarily an economic stimulus package. Overall, $2.1 trillion in aid was devoted towards business loans, supplemental unemployment insurance, one-time stimulus checks, and the coronavirus relief fund of about $150 billion. The act provided for forbearance of payments on federally backed mortgages and emergency housing assistance funds to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness or in low-income housing. The act prohibited landlords from evicting residents or charging late fees for non-payment and from evicting for any reason with fewer than 30 days notice. The scope and impact of that federal moratorium was unclear, as it only impacted about a third of all renters at that time. You can see from the chart on the right some of the distribution of nearly $6 million of CARES Act funds through the city of Winston-Salem to various organizations addressing emergency housing assistance, issues with food security, and other relief. The North Carolina Housing Opportunities and Prevention of Evictions program, or HOPE program, administered by the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience in the State Department of Public Safety, was funded by CARES Act funding. Allocations began accepting applications in October. The program provided rent and utility assistance to prevent evictions and utility disconnections. United Way of North Carolina and NC 211 provided call center support for this program. In less than a month, 37,000 renter households applied for assistance, and the program stopped taking new applications as of November 11th, as all funds had been committed. Initially, some landlords were unwilling to accept the terms of assistance. They refused HOPE payments, yet changes were made to the terms of the landlord agreement in January in order to entice more landlords to participate. According to recent news reports, just as 2 weeks ago, tenants have unfortunately faced utility cutoffs, threatened evictions, lack of communication from caseworkers administering the program, and 4 months after the application period had ended, only 55% of the funds had been paid to landlords and utility providers. Locally, a partnership between the city of Winston-Salem and the Winston-Salem Foundation, the United Way of Forsyth County, and Forsyth County government was formed with more than $3.6 million raised from local support. Local agencies and other nonprofit groups were selected for funding to provide food assistance, child care programs for essential workers, personal protective equipment, mental health counseling, assistance to immigrant families, assistance to victims of domestic violence, and ongoing rental assistance. This program is still continuing. Next, we'll discuss the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. In December, as part of the $900 billion Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, Congress created the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, many are referring to as ERAP. with $25 billion for rental assistance across the country, and some of which is already flowing directly to municipalities and county governments across the state. The ERAP program provides significantly more rent and other housing costs than the CARES Act did, up to 12 months, including arrears and prospective rent in 3-month increments forward. And unlike previous programs, landlords may initiate the application directly on behalf of their qualifying tenants. There's been more than $94 million in ERAP funding awarded to the counties and cities within the triad. You can see from this slide, the priority of the program is for those at 50% or less of area median income, unemployed for 90 days or more, and households with pending court evictions. Though the income limit does extend up to 80% or less of area median income and those experiencing financial hardships. Locally also, an eviction diversion mediation program has been established. The eviction diversion and mediation will provide relief to overburdened court systems, helping coordinate resources between various community agencies currently providing emergency rental assistance. The eviction diversion mediation program with Wake Forest University, Legal Aid of North Carolina, and the city of Winston-Salem has the potential to help both tenants and landlords during a time when housing instability not only threatens the well-being of those affected, but endangers the community as a whole. The program provides a platform for landlords and tenants to work through issues in a collaborative way that benefits both parties without the expense, hassle, or burden of contentious litigation. Guilford County has a similar program being administered by my research center, the Center for Housing and Community Studies. Finally, more help is on the way. 20% of all renters say today that they are not yet caught up on their rent, while a third of Black renters are behind. We see that those in the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are most impacted by rent insecurity and housing precarity. More rental assistance, though, is on the way through the American Rescue Plan, signed by President Biden on March 11th, and adding $21.6 billion to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. $10 billion towards homeowners, for homeowners to avoid foreclosures, $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers, and another $5 billion to help create housing services for people experiencing homelessness. Governor Cooper has also signed the North Carolina COVID response and relief bill on the same date as President Biden, adding additional state funds to the federal emergency rental assistance. We're hopeful that the combination of local support from philanthropy and city governments, county governments participation, state funds, federal funds, and all of the many organizations that are working on housing stabilization will begin to change the landscape of housing need and address not only the immediate issues of the crisis that the pandemic has brought, but the affordable issues that have been plaguing our housing market pre-pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richardson. We do have a few questions that I'm sorry, Dr. Seals. We have a few questions that were in the chat that we received in the comments, and I'm just going to start from the last question because it's probably the most recent one. And it looks like this question may be for Edward. Once the initial 1-year lease ends and the tenancy becomes month to month, the landlord, I think that's the answer to the question. Are there plans by the city of Winston-Salem or by housing advocates to have low-income housing for folks with mental health differences, including those who have substance dependency? That was a question that was presented, and I think that's around affordable housing and housing accessibility. There may be a question for Bianca's group, Dan, and Dr. Richardson.
Okay. Phyllis, can you repeat that question, please?
I sure can. The question is, are there plans by the city of Winston-Salem or by housing advocates to have low-income housing for folks with mental health differences, including those who have substance dependency?
I don't know any. I don't know any. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you. I don't know. I've not heard of any that are going up. I've not seen any on paper or anything. I think it's probably needed, but I don't know if it's being provided at this point in time or planned to be provided.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that either.
No. Thank you. The other question that also related to your group was that, can we tell by the information that was presented, is there a shortage of houses in Forsyth County?
Well, the information that we have relates to the first-time home buyers that we provide down payment assistance to. I can tell you that as far as the down payment assistance home buyers, we have seen a 59% decrease in available housing. Now, that doesn't speak to the available housing for the entire county and for those home buyers who are not receiving down payment assistance. This is just a snapshot of what we've been experiencing.
Phyllis, I'd like to add to that too, you know, is that everybody knows, I mean, it's hard to buy a house even if you're paying a lot of money for it now, but nobody's building in the low income area. You know, everything's over $200,000. You don't see anything less than $200,000 that's being built that's new. You know, Phyllis, it reminds me of going back to the days when Jane Milner was working with us and getting money from the city and other places to buy land and develop it and then sell it back to builders with the idea that they had to build it in an affordability range. And, you know, I think we need to start looking more and more at the supply versus just the demand, because the demand has really outstripped the supply for affordable homes in Forsyth County.
Right.
I would just build on that as well and say that the shortage is a national shortage right now. The statistic I saw yesterday was that our entire country is short 4 million homes. Part of that is due to the pandemic. But on the other side of that, there's a fair number of homes. We actually did it. My wife's a real estate agent, so I asked her to do an MLS listing of homes that cost less than $100,000, and there were actually over 100 homes for sale less than $100,000 in the county. The problem, and Dr. Lawson Clark touched on this, the problem is that if you want to try to get a mortgage for that amount of money, particularly if you're in the $80,000 and less, very, very few banks will write a mortgage for that amount. They say it's not profitable, there's no money in it. And so what happens is then you only have a market for cash buyers, and cash buyers tend to be flippers and they tend to be landlords. So our group at CSEM is actually taking a look at this problem, which is called the Small Mortgage Project, to look at sort of what are the seeds behind that, and that includes interviewing local bankers, real estate agents, and taking a look at actually the regulatory regime, which is actually put caps on what banks are charging, and that has led to a leaving of this market completely.
If I could jump in as well, Dr. Richardson brings up an important point here. In North Carolina, on the forms, when you submit a bid on a home, your realtor checks a box that says whether or not that's getting down payment assistance. And many sellers are hesitant when they've got a cash buyer on the hook versus somebody who's got down payment assistance to go with the cash buyer or with someone who has a traditional loan. There are folks like Sophia Crisp at Housing Consultants Group and others who are pushing to try to get that removed from the bid application because it gives unequal preference to those who have conventional loans over other types of programs. I also dropped in the chat, New America shows 16,244 units shortage for extremely low income households. Those are typically those under 50% AMI. And Urban Institute just did a study last year that looked at each of the regions within the state by larger areas, rural areas, et cetera, and has some really good numbers there for each county or each district. So that's at Urban Institute's urban.org, and you can look for Housing for North Carolina's Future.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that information. We will also make that available in the comments on the city's YouTube page as well. There is an additional question. This looks like this is for Edward Sharp. And that is there any recourse for a tenant that's being evicted because the landlord will increase the rent substantially after the lease ends?
The short answer is no. Once the initial term of the lease, which is usually 1 year, once that's over, the landlord is free to raise the rent. So what they say is, this is April, your rent for May is going to be another $100 higher. A surprisingly large number of landlords engage in exactly that practice. The law says they can do it now if the tenant does something that, in exercising the tenant's rights, for instance, calls the city of Winston-Salem code enforcement to come check the place out and make sure that it's in good working order, and the landlord is upset by that and raises the rent by some exorbitant amount as a way of punishing the tenant, that's prohibited as retaliation. It's extremely difficult to actually litigate retaliation in court. The tenant would basically have to refuse to pay the increased rent, and then the landlord would evict them, and then the tenant would go into court and present evidence of retaliation. It's extremely difficult and very rare, but that would be the only defense I know of to a rent increase like that.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And again, I want to thank all the panelists for the information that you presented today. And as we move to the final part of our presentation today, we're going to move on to our Breaking Barriers award winner. And we do have a short video to present, and that is going to be queued up right now. Thank you all.
When Ujima CDC celebrated the ribbon cutting for Emmanuel Retirement Village in 2019, it was the fulfillment of a goal set in 2005 by Emmanuel Baptist Church and its dynamic pastor, the Reverend John Mendez.
We were having a meeting at Emmanuel Baptist Church, and Reverend Mendez had an idea, since he had this property over here. He said, let's develop this property and let's make it housing for the elderly. He said, since we don't have too much money, let's see if we can get a CDC going. And we worked having meetings and conferences and going all over for the next 2 years to 3 years. And it got to a point, because the recession was not helping us, because we couldn't get funds like we would like to have. And so from that point on, we kind of slowed down.
For more than 5 years, the project sat in limbo as Ujima CDC worked to find a bank loan and reworked its plans to meet the zoning requirements for its building site. Eventually, with the help of $2.5 million in city housing bonds, the CDC secured the financing it needed.
We had plans to build in 2017, and that was the year where it rained and rained and rained and rained. And we started, but it rained so much we had to stop. The next year we started again. And we stopped, and then we started again. So it took us 2 years to get started.
Finally, on October 25th, 2019, officials gathered to open Phase 1 of the project, 28 one-bedroom units in a large apartment building and 14 two-bedroom apartments in duplexes with garages. Construction on 5 more duplex buildings should begin later this year. Currently, all the 1-bedroom apartments are rented, and there is a lengthy waiting list for the 2-bedroom units.
There's a need for housing, and we get calls all the time. We're filling a big hole because, from what I understand, there's a housing desert in this area. And I hate to say it, but it seems like this area's been forgotten a little bit. Well, let me say that I'm the president or director, and it wasn't me, it was us. We worked as a group. We had a very good board, and everybody is very anxious to build again. But I feel as though we did well. We hope that what we did here will help to spur some more growth and interest in this area, because this area really needs it.
And thank you. And congratulations once again to UGMA. They are certainly deserving of our Breaking Barriers Fair Housing Award. Now, I would definitely be remiss, yet again, if I did not acknowledge and thank Phyllis Caldwell-George for moderating this year's panel discussion, as well as all of the panelists that we heard from today. They did an outstanding job, and as you see, they have a great deal of expertise in their respective areas. So again, thank you to everyone who participated in the panel discussion. Also, I would like to thank again the New Horizons Fair Housing Committee of the Human Relations Commission for planning this year's virtual summit program. It was not an easy thing to do. I know that a lot of people think that if it's virtual, oh, it's not going to be as much involved, it won't be as hard. And I think that we can all assure you that it took quite a bit of coordination and crossed fingers hoping that the technology would cooperate. And we're just pleased that it all came together. So thank you to the New Horizons Fair Housing Committee. Thank you to the Human Relations Department staff, particularly Jamie Waldeck for being our tech person, representing our staff today, working in collaboration with Larry Bell, with the city's Marketing and Communications Department, and Frank Elliott. Thank you all for all of the hard work that you put into making this year's program possible. Again, thank you to Assistant Secretary Janine Warden from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So thank you, everyone. We hope that you will take this information back to your respective communities and share what you have learned. Also, if you know of people who would benefit from the information that was shared during today's program, please make sure that you share the link with them. The information that was shared in terms of documents will be on our website at www.cityofws.org/humanrelations. But to see the video in and of itself, it will be on the city's YouTube channel, and it will be on the City of Winston-Salem's website on demand. Okay, well, thanks again for joining us. I'm Wanda Allen Aberhoff, the Director of the Human Relations Department, and we hope to see you next year for year 16. And for closing comments, the final comment, we do dedicate this year's 15th annual summit in memory of Council Member and Mayor Pro Tem Vivian H. Burke, who passed away last May. She was always a staunch supporter of the department and this particular program, so we'd like to dedicate this year's program to Dr. Vivian H. Burke. Take care. Hope to see you next year.